Hey everybody, this is Dark Guardsman and we're back with another video. Now I didn't really plan to make a follow-up this quickly on doing more of the visualization stuff, but I was sitting here toying around with the numbers and working more on reverse engineering and kind of getting them turned into constants here so I could easily go through here and read the code and figure out what's going on. So we have figured out a little bit more. I have determined that the number 2, which we had sitting here next to flat distance, is literally 2 ticks per meter. So effectively that was what that does, and then of course we had the min flight time here. But something I just figured out, which has blown my mind, is the acceleration that we were calculating, which sets up the initial velocity and everything else, can quite literally be anything. And basically, thanks to the visualization tool, we can actually verify this, and I actually made some little dots. I also fixed a graphic problem we had last time where the start point and the end point were inverted. This is the start point down here, this is the end point down here, and it actually set up kind of correctly now. But what I've determined is that no matter what the acceleration is, for the distance given, it will always go from start point to end point at any value. So right now I've got it set to 1. Normally this would calculate to be like some point decimal value. You can see up here it's actually set to 1. If I sit here and I change this to 10 and reload the code, and we actually run the calculation again, we end up with the same exact thing. Not only do we end up with the same exact graph visually, we end up with the same exact data and everything else. Acceleration literally has no impact on the amount of time it takes for the missile to get to the target and the endpoint of the target. What it does actually have an impact on is the speed the missile does end up traveling, and it does have an impact on the max Y value. We can clearly go over here and see that we are ending up with this massively huge arc distance. We're traveling 400 kilometers, and we're ending up going to a max Y of 200 kilometers, and we're ending up traveling literally 2 kilometers a tick. So we end up going massive speed. But this is kind of mind-blowing, as this tells us that the acceleration itself has very little impact on how the equation actually ends up building up the start and end point calculations and everything else, which is really, really beautiful. This means we can actually arbitrarily replace various parts of this equation without really much care. And it makes a huge amount of stuff. It also kind of helps understand what's really going on here. And this is the reason why I just stuck a 1 there, as I was sitting there staring at it going, well, if max height controls the acceleration and we got the flight time, what happens if we start changing this? I realized the first thing I tried changing, of course, was changing the 2 around to a 3 and so on. I figured out that this 2 should really be up here, as there's no real explanation for it to be there. The only thing I could really think of why that's there is that max height is actually probably closer to arc length, because we have this value right here, which is arc length down here, and something tells me what that actually might have calculated is the halfway distance that was supposed to be traveled, and it didn't hit it perfectly, but somehow still ended up with it. And because the fact that acceleration could be anything and still function, nobody caught the fact that there was error in the math. So very likely what I'm going to end up going through here and actually doing is figuring out how to change this mathematical function, so that way max height actually does mean max height, and it actually will tell us the max point of the center point here, and actually still ends up making an acceleration value that makes sense to get to that height value, so that way in the configs we can control what the max height is simply by changing the scale and changing the initial height value here. So anyways, that's all I wanted to update really quickly here, because that's pretty mind-boggling for me that the acceleration could literally be set to anything and it still works. A really cool thing about this, that we did figure that out, is when we come in here later, we end up making cannons and artillery pieces and everything else with this mathematical function. That means we can set that acceleration to a constant value, because when you fire a round out of a cannon, it does have a pretty consistent acceleration that's being applied to it. Of course, it's going to lose... Well, let me rephrase this. It has an initial velocity it's applied to, and then it has a consistent acceleration from gravity, because there's no more acceleration being applied to it once it exits the barrel, because the gases that were accelerating it have stopped accelerating, so on and so on. I'll explain that in more detail another time if we ever do build an artillery piece. Anyways, I'll see you guys later with another video.